This discussion will cover constraints, geometric, dimensional, and implicit. Constraints govern the shape of your geometry, and it's pretty safe to say that without constraints there would be no CAD. There are some basic kinds of constraints: geometric, dimensional, and implicit. You can guess here from the list that we're really going to discuss implicit later. We'll focus here on geometric and dimensional. I'll warn you up front that there are some terminology issues here. What Catia calls a geometric constraint may be different than what you learned the definition to be in math class. And certainly every CAD system has their definitions of what their constraints are. It seems like everyone has a different definition. Here's one: that there are three types of constraints: geometric, numerical, and symmetrical. I think most of the definitions agree that geometric constraints don't have a number and dimensional constraints do have a number. But now let's look at something like perpendicularity. Is it geometric or dimensional? Almost everybody says it's geometric, and there's the little symbol for it right there. But is it really an angle constraint where the angle's 90 degrees? Well, there's a number. So everyone has a different definition. We're going to use Catia's definitions for these three different constraints. So again, these are the types of constraints that Catia has that are geometric, that Catia has that are dimensional, and implicit, we're going to discuss those a little later. But constraints can be either in 2D or 3D. Here we're going to talk primarily about 2D constraints made in the Sketcher toolbar workbench. There are 3D constraints that you're able to do in the dialog boxes, and even 3D constraints that you'll learn to do in assembly design when you're working with products. The Sketcher constraints, we have a Sketcher toolbar, and there are two primary tools that are used to set constraints, but then also the right mouse button can also be used to make constraints in Sketcher. So here we take a look at, we're going to be doing geometric and dimensional constraints using the toolbars and the right mouse button. So let's jump into Catia now and take a look at creating these. Okay, here we are in the Catia world now. Let's take a look at Sketcher Workbench. Let's select the Sketcher icon and pick a plane. Now we're in Sketcher. First thing I want to do is get my toolbars set up so that we can discuss constraints. Usually for our classes we like to turn on the graphics toolbar, and I dock it right up in the upper left hand corner. Then I dock this floating toolbar to get it out of the way, and this one we usually dock, but I'm going to put it right here because we're going to use this in our discussion today. And then I'm going to pull out the constraint toolbar, and this constraint toolbar I'm going to dock at the top and then pull it down so that it's horizontal. So these two toolbars we're going to use when discussing constraints. Okay, now let's take a look at creating some geometry and adding some constraints to it. I'm going to turn off this icon right here for geometrical constraint, and I'm going to turn off this one for dimensional constraint. And I'm going to create a simple rectangle. Now this rectangle is by default vertical and horizontal, but it's not constrained to be vertical and horizontal. See that you can actually muck this up quite a bit to being a different shape. Let me delete this, and now I'm going to turn on this geometric constraint icon. And then when I create geometry, it's going to add geometrical constraints if it can. And sure enough, this one was horizontal, so now it's constrained to be horizontal with those little H's there, and the same for the verticals. They're constrained to be vertical. Now I'm going to delete this, and we're going to do it again with this off, except this time we're going to add them in after the fact. We're going to muck it up a little bit here, okay? And now we're going to pick this line, and we're going to pick this icon here, and this icon is we're going to add a horizontal to that. Now, a little warning box here. You notice the little H up here. This is now a horizontal line. Okay? And when I say OK, the H disappears. It's not constrained to be horizontal. Let's do it again. Pick this icon. Except this time I'm going to come up here and turn on the geometric constraint icon. This will make it permanent. So when I say horizontal, it's horizontal. No warning box, because it's now telling me that you have this turned on. It will stay horizontal. And in fact, you can even multi-pick things. I can pick this item, Control key, pick this icon, and now pick here, and let's pick vertical. Now both of those are vertical, okay, and they're constrained to be vertical. Now this line is not. Now I'm going to Control Z to back up out of this a little bit, okay. Now we don't have verticals on there anymore. Let me pick this one and hold the Control key down and pick this one. One of the options is to put an angle between the two instead of making them vertical. You could also add a parallelism. If I select parallelism, oops, wrong one, parallelism, okay, it actually puts this little parallelism symbol in here, and then now those are constrained to be parallel, okay. Let me delete that. Let's come out here, and let's put a constraint on this one and this one for an angle. Control key to hold and multi-select both, and let's select an angle. Okay. Okay, it's warning me that something, and when I say OK, the angle disappeared. That's because I didn't have this icon on. This one is for dimensional constraints. And now if I do select this line and this line, hold the Control key down to do that multi-select, and select here, it will give me an angle. And now when I select OK, the angle stays. Okay? So now I have an angle between those two elements. Okay? Now let's discuss a little bit about offsets versus lengths. I'm going to create some simple geometry here. I'm going to turn these icons off, and I'm going to create a rectangle. Now remember that these are vertical and horizontal, but they're not constrained. But I won't touch them yet. I won't muck them up. And I'm going to put, using this icon, a length constraint here. I'm also going to, you say, well, that's really the distance between those two lines also. But it's not the distance between those two lines. It's the length of this line. Because what I can do is I can actually change how this looks. And now it's obviously not the distance between those two lines. Okay? Now, let's delete this, and let's make the same rectangle. Turn on geometric constraints. Okay? And now let's put a offset on. Select the constraint icon, and let's pick this line. Now by default it goes into length mode. But if you pick a second element, it gives the appropriate dimension. Now that is an offset, because if I delete this line, it's still there. It's still the offset between those two. Or Control Z to put the line back in. And even if I were to move this point here, this line could get longer, but that's still the offset. Okay? Now, when you pick the constraint icon, when you select one line, you get the length by default until you pick another element. Now, in this case, it's not going to give me an offset because there is no offset between these two. This is definitely an angle. Okay? Okay, so now we've covered a little bit about both of these icons. For this icon, you actually have to have something pre-selected for it to appear. For this icon, you can have something pre-selected, but you don't have to. You can select the icon first and then the line. Okay? So now let's talk about why I use this one a lot more than I use this one. Okay? Let's create some simple geometry. Using the profiler tool, I'm just going to come out here and I'm going to create some geometry. Okay, here we go. There. Okay, my geometric constraint icon was on, so I got some constraints. I got these tangencies right in here and a lot of other things. But now I'd like to put a lot of dimensions on this. Normally, I double-click this icon, and I just come in, and I just start dimensioning like this, just picking. And so I can just make a run on the entire part this way by, picking all kinds of elements and just setting the dimensions. Okay? So that's one way to use this icon to create continuous dimensions. Okay? Now, there is another way to create a lot of dimensions using this icon. So if I multi-select everything and select this icon, there's an option to do links. Uh-oh. It's telling me I need to turn on this icon before saying OK, otherwise those will disappear. And I want to create radiuses and diameters and say OK. Wow, that created a lot of links. Now, if I had wanted the offset between these two rather than the length of this line, I can simply come in here and delete this and go put it back in as an offset. Okay? So there's a lot of, sometimes that icon is a great way to get a lot of dimensions out. And obviously I may want an angle in here. It didn't give me that. Well, you can put that in after the fact. Okay, and maybe delete this one. There we go. So we've learned how to use both of these icons, and we've learned how these icons interact with these icons. Next, we're going to learn how to use the right click on your mouse to create constraints also. Okay, now let's look at using the right mouse button. Let's select an element. I want to make this horizontal. So I'll select it, right click, Object, Horizontal. And now I have a little H on there. And notice that this icon was on, so the H stays there permanently. Okay? I want to make this vertical. I'm going to pick it, and I'm going to pick this one too with the Control key, multi-select both of them. And now I'm going to right-click Objects, Vertical. Now those are vertical. I can add a tangency in here by selecting, now right-click Objects, and where's my tangency option? Oh, there is no tangency option. So there are some things that you can do with a right click and others that you can't. In this case, if I wanted to make these two elements tangent, I have to pick one of these buttons. So if I pick this button, it gives me some kind of a length constraint, and I can right click and pick tangency here. This isn't normally what we mean by right click. So we're going to discuss that kind of a right click in just a little bit. Okay. So in order to put an angle between these two, I can't do that with a right click. But what I can do with right clicks is sometimes change some options. Like for instance, I'm going to delete that and I'll make this come up here. Okay. So let's say I select this line and I select this line and I right click Objects. Well, there is no option to make them parallel. If I select this option, they're at a little bit of an angle now, so they're not parallel. I can right click within this menu and say parallel. And now that they're parallel, I can right click again and say distance and then set it. So with these icons, a lot of times if you don't like what you see, you can right click and get some additional options. So for instance, let's say I have a circle drawn out here. Let's get rid of this tangency that popped up here. Okay, let's draw it again without a tangency. There we go. Now I want to make this circle tangent to this circle. So I select my icon and I select this one. Default gives me a radius. When I select this one, default gives me a distance. Now I can right click and say tangency or concentricity. If I select concentricity, the two circles are placed one inside another. Okay. Now let's take a look at that again. Control Z, 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 Z. Okay. Now let's do that again. Let's do this one. Let's pick this one, right click, tangency. Now those two are tangent. And because I have this icon turned on, that tangency remains. So this is your constraint icon where you select one element or two elements, and then if you right click, you see additional options. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about some more of the right click options. Now, this line is obviously not vertical, and it's at a way different angle than this line here. So let's put the constraint on between these two, and by default, it's going to give me an angle. If I right click on these though, one of the options is to make them perpendicular or parallel. Coincidence would mean that they need to touch in some way. Tangency, that doesn't really make sense to us here in this situation, but here's where we're going to talk today, is the allow symmetry line. And when we allow symmetry line, it's now waiting for me to pick a symmetric line. And read this little prompt down here in the lower left-hand corner. Position the dimension or select a symmetry line. If I pick this axis right here, now it's used that axis line as a symmetry line for the two, and they both have the same angle now, and if I push one towards the origin or pull it away from the origin, they both move the same. And in fact, if I put an angle on here between this one and this one, and I change this angle from 117 to say 80, they both change by the same angle. Okay, so now both of those are 80 degrees. Okay, so that's allow symmetry line, which is, traditionally we've said that a single click on one element, another click you can pick two elements. Well, with symmetry you actually get to pick a third element. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the fix and the fix together icon. Here's the fix together icon, and fix is part of this icon here. So let's put a dimension on between these two lines here. Select constraint and pick one line and pick another line. Now it's 50 degrees. I'd like to make it 120. When I hit enter, this line moved way down. What I really wanted is this other line to move over. So there's where fix comes in. Let's Control Z to back out of that, and let's delete that dimension. Now let's select this line, select this icon for constraint definition, and let's fix that element. Notice the little boat anchor that's put on here. That boat anchor means that the length of this line can change, but it's fixed in space. I can't move it up or down. Okay. So now if I put a dimension on between these two here, I'm assured that when I change that dimension, this green line is not going to move. In fact, if I change this, let's change it to 90. Okay. So now we're assured that this line is going to be the one that moves. Okay. A lot of times what I'll do is put these fixed constraints on just temporarily. I'll delete them after I get it done, because maybe what I would really want to do is put the angle on here now. So sometimes they just keep your geometry from being squiggly on you while you're creating it. Now let's take a look at what this fixed together means. I'm going to delete this geometry, and I'll just create a simple line here and a circle. Now these circle and line are free to move independently of each other. Now I'm going to select both of them and pick fix together, and notice this icon that comes right here, and it says that the endpoints and the line itself and the center of the circle and the circle are all fixed together, which means I cannot change the length of this line. They're all fixed together. They move as a group now. They move and rotate as a group. If I were to try to put a dimension on this circle and give it a radius value, I can't, because it's fixed together with this group. That purple means over-constrained. If I were to try to put a length on this line, that's over-constrained. I cannot change the length of the line. Now, what I can do, though, let's move this whole group down here a little. Let's put an angle between this line and this axis. So let's put a dimension between here and here. There's an angle of 60 degrees. Let's change that angle to 20. So, oops, there we go. So the entire group moves together to the new angle of 20. So that's the difference between fix together and fix. Now, let's delete this dimension here. Let's select this line and fix that line. Now this group of elements has a fix and a fix together on it, which means that it can't be drug up or down. It can slide this way or this way, and you can't change anything else about the circle and its relative position. Okay, let's wrap up this section on sketcher constraints, telling you how to detect constraints. So notice, let's get up over here. As I draw a line, if it's vertical, it's picking up a vertical constraint and a horizontal, and then I come down to pick up another vertical, horizontal, and then when I come up here, notice the little blue line that's detected. That's picking up a coincidence constraint with that line. So now you notice that little circle that's there. Okay, there, and let's double click. So now if I change this line, if I move it up and down, those two are tied together by that coincidence constraint. Notice the little ball that's there, okay, and that goes to a little ball that's over there. If I delete that, then these two move independently. It's really nice to have those detections a lot of times as you're drawing geometry. However, sometimes when you're drawing geometry and there's a lot of other geometry around, it becomes very difficult to draw anything because, oh my gosh, look at there, I want to draw this line at an angle, but I'm picking that up. Oh, look, it created a constraint to that center, and up, I'm creating constraints all over the place now. And it just makes it hard to draw anything that can be modified later because you've got all these constraints that are, uh-oh, now things are wiggling all over the place. So I'm going to Control Z to back out of this. Now when I select my profiler, I'm going to hold the Shift key down. And now when you hold the Shift key down, you're able to draw without picking up any of those constraints. However, notice that you are not picking up the horizontal and verticals either. So you lose some and you gain some. So I'm not a big fan of the Shift key, but here's where I am a big fan is occasionally when I'm drawing, I'll Control Z back out of this. You can use it at will. So I'll start over here and I'll click, I'll pick up my vertical, and I'm having trouble here with my horizontal. See, it's snapping way over to those other things. So I'll hold my Shift key now to just temporarily turn off that detection. And I'll draw it like right here. I'll make it horizontal after the fact. Now I'm having no problems with the vertical. And I'll come over here. I'm having no problems with this horizontal, But now I'm having problems here with the vertical. So I'm going to hold the Shift key down and then just make it here, and then I'll double click here. So I picked up some, and a few of them I held the Shift key down just to get the lines drawn.